This is the North Korea its leaders want the world to see. A land where housing is said to be not only free for those who work, but people do not even know how much a home costs. All housing since 1958 is said to be owned and freely distributed by the state. Yet, if this is the case, why are there seemingly hundreds of thousands of homeless North Koreans? Where are they? Who are they? And is North Korea in the midst of a hidden housing crisis? Much of our knowledge about North Korea is murky at best. But it's agreed by all sides that there were scores of North Korean homeless in the early 1950s when the Korean War started.
On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea.
The war led to North Korea becoming the second most bombed country in history at that time, only behind Nazi Germany. With about 75% of its capital city, Pyongyang, and most of its cities almost completely leveled to the ground. For perspective, while 40,000 tons of bombs were dropped by the Nazis onto Britain during World War II, 600,000 tons of bombs were dropped by the US onto North Korea during the Korean War. A Polish diplomat in 1951 recorded that there are very few houses left in Pyongyang. Haggard children are nesting in caves in the hills. During the war, people were forced to live in dugouts in the mountains and countryside to escape the bombardment. It's estimated the vast majority of North Korea's houses today were built in the decades following the war, between the 50s and 90s. There are no surviving accounts by homeless people about their lives during this period, but from the photos and footage that remain, life was clearly extremely dangerous and unpredictable, with deep fear for what the skies brought next. Although technically the war did not end, heavy fighting did cease and Reconstruction began in 1953. Despite tens of thousands of men killed, the traditional bread makers of the family, Reconstruction had such momentum that it initially outpaced South Korea. This was mainly because most of the region's heavy infrastructure was already in the north, and truckloads of vital aid were sent by the likes of the USSR and China. There's the so-called Cholima movement from 1958, named for the mystical 1,000km/h Korean horse called Cholima, which resembled the speed in which the state wanted the nation's recovery to occur. Grand, unverifiable accounts of housing being built in a mere 14 minutes were recorded, as armies of soldiers became armies of builders. In 1 month alone, in 1958, 17,000 families were said to have been housed. Material aid was transported by not only the USSR and China, but also East Germany, Albania, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Poland and Bulgaria. Even when you look at North Korea today, with its Soviet-style grey concrete block appearance, this was due to it following the designs of the re-emerging cities of Warsaw, Berlin and Moscow. Pyongyang was rebuilt in the so-called 3 and 5 year plans between 1954 to 1961. Similarly, the second largest city, Hamhung, was rebuilt from 1955 to 1962, thanks to East German aid. Yet, while the industry boomed, the country's agriculture stagnated, which led to the deadly famine that emerged in 1954 to 1955. The focus on speed and subsequent lack of regulation led to rushed housing, often with many families sharing one bathroom and kitchen. In 1957, Kim Il-sung still referred to North Korea's housing as a, quote, difficult and long-term problem. In the 1960s, the North Korean economy continued to improve gradually, and it was even viewed as a role model by Latin America. While one Venezuelan observer remarked at the lack of indoor heating, the revolutionary Che Guevara believed out of all the nations he travelled to, quote, Korea is one of the most extraordinary, perhaps the one that impressed us the most of all, unquote. North Korea presented itself as a workers' paradise, while, behind the scenes, they were struggling to provide the bare essentials. Kim Il-sung privately summed up in 1968 that he believed, quote, there are no hungry or naked people in the DPRK, but there are also no especially rich and overfed people. The population lives in average abundance, unquote. The late 60s intensified what have been called political loyalty checks, as a three-class division was created, separating the population between those who are either A. loyal, B. Tending to be loyal, and C. Those deemed untrustworthy by the Kim regime. This meant 2/3 of the population, the last two categories, were discriminated against, especially with the provision of housing. As the state owned all the property, the state dictated the area and quality of each citizen's accommodation. The capital Pyongyang, Nampo, near the coastlines or borders, were all out of bounds for those in the lowest class. While the very size of one's home often told one's social class, housing certificates were not proof of ownership, but proof the state permitted you to live there. In 1970, while the North Korean Congress hailed how workers had, quote, built up the capital city of Pyongyang more splendidly and comfortable modern farmhouses for hundreds of thousands of households, Kim Il-sung was still concerned with solving what he called, quote, the present housing shortage, unquote. In 1974, an observer noted an apparent abundance of electricity, how, quote, the apartments of Pyongyang provide better living conditions than large sections of cities like New York or Philadelphia, unquote, and yet still spoke of a widespread lack of running water. What is known for certain is that the oil crisis of 1973 impacted North Korea gravely, marking a turning point for when the south of Korea became more prosperous than the north. The price of goods fell steeply globally, which especially hurt North Korean exports. Nevertheless, between 1978 to 1984, 200 to 300,000 houses were said to have been constructed in the second 7-year plan. The first half of the early 1980s, the nation produced enough food to not need sizable foreign donations, and in 1985 even exported food. This was not to last, however. From the 1990s, the initial first-hand accounts of homeless North Koreans emerged, from those that managed to escape the complete disaster that struck the country.
This stunting is going to affect an entire generation.
We found a lot of the hospitals were virtually empty.
The misery is concealed behind the doors.
The government blamed floods, sweeping away the food that was going to feed the country. It should be remembered though, the same devastating rains and winds that hit North Korea hit South Korea, but comparatively had a tiny impact. North Korean casualty estimates differ drastically, from hundreds of thousands to more than 1 million people who starved, were killed or died of disease, compared to only a few hundred casualties in the south. Although North Korea claimed to survive on its own without outside help, the famine coincided with the cutting of vital foreign aid, especially oil and petroleum needed for fertilizers and agricultural machinery from the likes of the USSR, which had collapsed in 1991, and from China, which had lessened its support to grow relations with the US. North Korea only had about 20% of arable land and had become over-dependent on fertilizer. It was during the 90s that the North Korean term for homeless, kutsubi, was said to have been created, originally only referring to homeless children and then coming to mean all homeless people. The word likely came from Russian migrant workers in North Korea who called these poor, roaming individuals as wanderers or nomads, kochevoi. Another theory for where the word came from is that kutsubi came from the Korean for wandering swallows, after how homeless children flocked towards food scraps left over on the ground by passers-by. Joseph Kim, Lee Jun, Sungmi Han, Sungju Lee, Ji Sung Ho and Yoon Seung Kim are some of our rare sources from North Korea who used to be kutsubi themselves. They described how the majority of the population, roughly 2/3, depended on food distributed by the state, which was abruptly cut. Most people did not have safe places for their savings, as banks were not trusted and credit cards were non-existent. Only those who were able to adapt by scavenging for food or otherwise survived.
That the government provided everything. They were told to do what the government asked, and as long as they follow the commands, the rations and everything was provided. North Koreans were never really ready to hustle on the street.
For Joseph Kim, to become ready to hustle on the street took enormous courage.
I think what helped me to give up my pride and be able to ask from strangers was from seeing other homeless kids dying away on the ground, and that really made me scared that if I don't speak up, I would also become one of them.
Rather than speaking up, Sungmi Han looked for areas where people with food were the most likely to come through her rural village.
I couldn't say anything, and then stand there and then just behind them and then looking at them, and then just they ask, "Are you want some food?" And then I said, just shake my head.
You just nod.
And they just give me, and then I just run to my mom and then share with my mom.
Others, like Sungju Lee, did whatever was necessary to survive the next day.
In the morning, usually police officers come to a train station and then they kick the people.
who is sleeping, and then there are 2 dead bodies in every morning, and then the police officer picked us. Guys, you have to move these bodies to a certain place, and we had to move that bodies to a certain place. Then they give us like bread, corn bread. So that's why our prayer was like that. We want to see more dead bodies next morning.
Homeless people were most likely buried in unmarked graves. Any wood left behind would be taken for warmth. Yoon-Sun Kim described how the famine consumed most people's thoughts entirely.
Always, the thinking is always focused on the food, nothing else. No future, no dream, nothing else, no family, just the food. After 6 days, my mom came back to home. However, she didn't bring any food. So my mom said, let's die together.
One who managed to cross the border, Lee Jun, became an underground North Korea reporter.
탈북까지 하게 돼 정말 이 중국 땅까지 들어와 살겠다고 온 가족조차 없고 죽어가는 엄마도 없고서 내 여기를 건너올 때는 정말 맨풀 살만한 것도 정말 내 한나 빼도 못해. 우리 아이들이 정말 뭐 살이라는 건 하나도 없고 몇 뼈가 나와 일어날 맥도 없어 누워 있는 거 보고 그래 여기로 이래도 죽고 저래도 죽겠는 거 차라리 굶어 죽느니 밥에다 해서 먹다 죽으라. 그래 엄마도 여기로 업어건네놓고 또 엄마 여기 왔으니까 나도 또 이래 여기 왔.
Ji Sung-ho testified to the apathy felt towards the disabled homeless.
2000년에 저는 중국으로 목발 짚고 건너갔습니다. 몇 킬로그램의 쌀을 구해왔고 중국에서는 우리 가족보다 개들이 더 잘 먹고 있다는 것을 알게 되었습니다. 북한에 돌아와서 저는 경찰에 잡히게 되었고 경찰은 너 같은 병신이 중국 땅으로 넘어가서 구걸을 한 것은 공화국의 수치라고 이야기했습니다. 다리가 없는 제가 중국에 가서 구걸한 것이 나라와 수령의 이미지를 망쳤다는 것입니다. 저는 제 가져온 쌀을 압수당했고 고문을 당했습니다. 저같이 잡힌 다른 사람들보다도 더 심한 고문을 당했고 저는 그것이 마음에 큰 상처가 되었습니다. 그런 불의가 저를 북한을 탈출하게 하였고 2006년 목발을 짚고 남동생과 함께 탈북하였습니다.
One thing in common with the Kotzebue stories is that none of them occurred in the country's capital. As harvests washed away in the floods, what little remained was prioritized for government elites and the army. When North Korea reached desperate heights, it did request aid from the international community, but still restricted where the aid was reaching.
우리나라에서 대체로 보면 그 저쪽의 북쪽 지역에서는 기본 농업을 물론 농사를 하지만 거기서 생산하는 생산물이 극히 제한되어 있습니다. 그렇기 때문에 우리가 이쪽 서해안 농업에서도 우리 서해안 지대에 집중해가지고 서해안 지대나 쌀을 다 북쪽에다 공급해 준다.
The state's help amounted to homeless shelters which may have helped at one point, but were quickly overwhelmed during the famine. The leader at that time, Kim Jong-il, formed what came to be known as 927 camps to gather the homeless in 1995. After a few years in 1999, estimates of how many were sent to these camps ranged from 63,000 to 315,000. Joseph Kim and Sung-Ju Lee explained how children were also used as, quote, free labour, unquote, in the unheated shelters, repairing buildings, breaking rocks, or farming rice, all for maybe a few spoons of gruel a day. During harvest seasons, which were already weak given the droughts, there may have been some food available, but otherwise there often wasn't enough food to go around. There were cases of local authorities living off what was meant for the children and abusing girls for their own pleasure. Leaving the country was fraught with danger, and not only because of the trigger-happy border guards. Song Mi-han was afraid of the very real possibility of being human trafficked.
So my aunt and uncle was warned me that I could be sold in China.
In China, to be sold as a sexual slave.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was scared.
Of course.
And the second broker when came to me, and my aunt and uncle scared me again. Like if you go there, my body parts also could be sold.
Yes. So organ trafficking.
Yes.
They take your organs away. Yeah.
So it was like, no way.
Yeah.
Eventually, after hundreds of thousands of tons in aid were sent, the country did recover. The food markets the Kotzebue stole from are called Yangmadan, often referred to as a black market, but more of a black food market than anything else. While men were forced to continue working in their state-approved jobs that paid barely anything, married or widowed women were not forced to work, so many women had the opportunity to create their own source of income by selling food grown in their own small plot of land, or other goods smuggled from abroad at these Yangmadang. The historian Andrei Lankov estimated about 80% of ordinary people's incomes in the early 2000s covered spending at these private markets. Housing officials were bribed to allow for the secret selling of houses, as residency certificate names were quietly rewritten. In 2002, the government stopped providing housing benefits, requiring everyone to start paying for rent and things like electricity and heating. Since people's electricity use couldn't be measured, authorities instead counted how many electric devices you had. From 2005 to 2009, authorities attempted to stamp down harder on the prevalence of private business. Most visibly, this occurred in November 2009, when the value of the North Korean currency, called the won, was cut by 10 times to punish those who became newly rich, the so-called donju, from the black markets, the Yangmadang. Although the policy was quickly backpedaled, it still resulted in many losing not only their fortunes, but their homes. Statistics are always unreliable in North Korea, so answering how many homeless people have been or are in North Korea is impossible, as we don't even know precisely how many people are in North Korea. Out of its over 70-year history, only in 2 years, 1993 and 2008, did North Korea release a public census. While no country currently has exact estimates of their homeless population, given how difficult it would be to accurately count and to unanimously define homelessness, looking for any such estimates in North Korea would be futile. On the other hand, we can still look towards statistics recorded after natural disasters, other than those in the 90s which have continued to cause havoc. There were only 5 years between the years 1995 to this year that North Korea did not have some sort of serious and damaging floods: 2001, 2008, 2009, 2017 and 2022. Some researchers, more recently, have gone as far as to use light satellite data to estimate poverty levels. According to the regime, sanctions are another significant cause of homelessness in the DPRK. They were intended to incentivize the ruling Kims to abandon not only their nuclear weapons, but their extensive prison camps, opposing political ideology, and to stop funding war, terrorism, and illicit hacking activities. Instead, sanctions have prevented none of these things, but certainly contributed to the suffering of its ordinary people. Sanctions had restricted the ability of North Koreans to obtain much needed fertilizer in the wake of the 90s famine, and humanitarian aid has also been restricted. On the other hand, the tougher UNSC sanctions of 2006 rather coincided with economic growth within the country. Food prices had remained relatively stable, as did the currency market exchange. Migrants are another supposed cause of housing shortages. North Korea is still one of the most inaccessible countries to visit in the world, with foreigners forbidden from purchasing housing and are only permitted to visit if staying in designated Pyongyang apartments. Tall apartments are only built in areas that can be seen by tourists, to imply an abundance of living space. North Korean authorities have attempted to employ the homeless to build national construction projects, but with little success. Over the past 2 decades, high-rise apartments have often been funded through foreign investors, selling the property off with high interest rates. The 2017 survey of North Korean defectors found that only 18% lived in housing assigned to them by the state.
이상에서 본 바와 같이 신형 코로나 비루스는 전염성이 매우 강하고 사망까지 초래하는 위험한 악성 비루스로서 우리는 이에 대해서 잘 알고 이 비루스가 우리나라에 절대로 침습하지 못하도록 강한 대책을 세워나가야 할 것입니다.
Recent events like the COVID pandemic only led to further crackdowns on homelessness, as numbers rose in every major city, with the homeless segregated on the grounds of virus spread prevention. Housing prices flew up as the region went into strict lockdown and construction was paused. Many who used their houses as collateral for loans subsequently were left on the streets. In February 2020, Kim Jong-un ordered the amount of homeless to be counted. Later that summer, task forces were ordered to step up their efforts in moving homeless to labour camps, despite lacking funds for even national housing projects. In 2021, a child was wrongfully detained as a Kotzebue in Chongjin, forced to wash laundry and cut trees for 2 weeks before their release. In July 2022, task forces were told to clamp down on homelessness around the Chinese border. North Korea's law enforcement agency in 2023 declared anyone staying in a train station, which were usually heated, for longer than 3 hours to be arrested. Intended tourist hotspots such as Wonsan Kalma coastal tourist zone transformed into squatting hubs. Each year from 2021 to 2026, 10,000 houses were to be built in the capital, demonstrating how the government's priorities remained with its army and elite. To conclude, while homeless people in countries outside North Korea become invisible, homeless North Koreans remain invisible. Censored from the outside world, it is impossible to count them, impossible to communicate with them, impossible to help them, as global humanitarian aid is directed elsewhere. Rather than having convinced the Kims to abandon their nuclear weapons or be overthrown by a vengeful populace, ordinary people continue to suffer as they accept their dire circumstances as unpreventable, or worse, as normal. The regime continues to pursue its own policies that do not support those unable or unwilling to work for them. Family houses are shoddily rebuilt, knowing they'll only need to be rebuilt again following the next natural disaster, and only those who escape can act as voices for the voiceless. The stories of those who lived homeless on the North Korean streets will be left unheard without organisations such as Link, which send money towards rescuers residing on their borders, which can be found in the description. It is with a twisted irony that in North Korean state media, fingers are instead pointed at the US's and Europe's own homeless crisis, and are exaggerated further to persuade anyone wishing to leave. Therefore, homelessness outside of North Korea continues to justify the Kim regime to loudly and proudly boast and claim, however untruthfully, that they, not the capitalist imperialist West, actually care about equality and the human right to housing, that they are the nation with not a single person sleeping on the streets. Thanks for watching.